Wicked Hong Kong Stories by George Adams. Copyright 1992 by George Adams. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe. It is of course a shocking experience to discover that one's Filipina domestic servant has a sex life, however confined, of her own. It is, however, quite a different matter to find out that the object of her passion is one's own husband. Everything was going wrong recently for Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe. The children were developing into unwashed beatniks, the dog was growing unaccountably neurotic, her cellulitis was becoming chronic despite the hydrotherapy, and rich wealth property management had turned their luxury flat high on the hill into a living but expensive hell. As Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe looked out onto the lower levels of Hong Kong that Monday morning, through the gap in the soiled piece of plastic sheeting, past the connecting joint of the rickety bamboo scaffolding lashed carelessly to her balcony, and avoiding the overlapping rubber plant she had repositioned after the assault by falling fragments of masonry from the floors above, she saw yet another cement mixer winding its way up the hilly road leading to her colonial home. Where, she wondered, did the Hong Kong developers still find room to dump concrete? Surely there was enough of the stuff already. She had chaotic visions of the whole of Hong Kong Island, cracking, then sliding into the festering sewer of its fragrant harbour. The Valium were obviously not working so well that morning. She should have suspected something right from the beginning. That afternoon, some 2 years ago, when she had just arrived in Hong Kong and was adjusting to the privileges of being, in a relative sense, a member of the moneyed class, she had summoned the girl she had selected at the agency to a first meeting. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe, a tall and pretty woman, somehow run to seed, had made a special effort to make herself imposing for the occasion, so as to intimidate Ruby from the start. First steps were, of course, of the utmost significance, or so she had read in the guides she had perused in the South China Morning Post family bookshop devoted to such onerous tasks. Mrs. Beaton's guide had been especially inspiring, with its recommendations of cheery greetings to the cook in the morning and firmness at every juncture. In the beginning, it had been quite a novelty to have someone around at one's beck and call, day and night as it were. In the end, it was an uncommon bore, given the lack of privacy and the enforced idleness domestic servants brought in their wake. There was no more ironing, no more cooking, no more shopping, except of a personal and extravagant kind, and finally, in her case, no more sex. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe had always regarded the physical side of marriage with the prim fortitude of a good many compatriots of her class. The attitudes of the last century had not quite died out. There were certain things she simply could not and would not do, principally taking the initiative. The practices outlined in Cosmopolitan magazine, which she now bought more often, although it made her feel frankly 112, were ludicrous and out of the question. They were, in all likelihood, solely for Americans. That, she felt, was enough said. Yes, it must have begun then, some sparkling of David's eye, some suggestion in the curve of Ruby's lips, some secret agreement of the soul. The actual advent of the sordid couplings was not known to her, but she did know that 3 weeks ago, returning early from a protracted meeting of a ladies' club in order not to miss a favourite TV programme, another David Attenborough, as she recalled, she had found David, her husband, in medias res, as it were, on their heavy marble coffee table. More accurately, Ruby was on top of him, something she still objectively admired for the gymnastic skill it clearly exhibited. With relative composure under the circumstances, Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe had simply stared, exhaled slightly, and walked calmly into her bedroom, bolting the door deliberately behind her. She had not sobbed or caused a scene. she never caused a scene. David had written her a long note defending himself in terms of a momentary lapse and a shocking incident never to be repeated. Ruby was looking for another employer. The mail that morning composed the usual Hong Kong mass of bank circulars, official receipts, club newsletters, and the solicitations from property agencies. One certainly had a sense of purpose in Hong Kong. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe's Women's Association was sponsoring a 5-year-old child from Ghana. A price of an ordinary Hong Kong lunch kept the child from starvation for weeks, she was told. But there was always the hunger of the soul. How much money was needed to assuage that pain, the boredom of life, now that the facade had cracked? She'd built up a hard wall against the Chinese on arrival. They simply didn't come into the daily round. How could they? Who knew them, except those who had, for some peculiar reason, married into them? Now, those around her were no solace for the void within. Each day was a journey without maps. But appearances had to be kept up. There never could be a crisis. The infidelity was something one had to accept in the course of a marriage. Men were, unfortunately, men. Some trigger within them apparently propelled their loins towards any available object. David was in Asia, after all. The women just flaunted themselves. Everyone knew that. And Ruby, well, she was lonely. It was clear that it had all been desperation on her part. As to the power of Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe's rationalization grew, she became convinced that life could take on its usual run of small satisfactions and great comforts, given a period of what? Expiation? That was surely asking too much. Forgetfulness? That would only come with the destruction of the dreadful images of that fateful evening. Forgiveness? There were certain things one could not forgive. Perhaps the necessity of their relationship alone would heal the wound. The rightness of their union was, under every analysis, inviolable. The telephone rang, and Bonnie, the Yorkshire Terrier, began to emit her plangent yelp. The dog sniffed around her mistress's beige tights for a moment as she picked up the receiver, found no new stimulation, and scurried to its basket under the wine table. "Dorothy," the voice said, "it's Jill. Thought I'd call to confirm this afternoon at the Active Life Centre. Yes, thought you might look in at Payne Trelford later on. Got a sale on. Saw the most adorable chinoiserie. See you." The voice disappeared into the void. Jill tended to speak in contracted flashes of thought, like the Chinese hairdresser Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe had once visited. "You want perm? Not too short?" Every phrase was a cliché of some kind, a sort of poor novelette means of communicating, where every possible experience was conveyed or interpreted within fixed parameters. Dorothy had become more aware of it recently, as her own experience set her outside the boundary. If she had attempted to explain how she felt to Jill, even using the latter's own babbling phrases, she felt sure she would not be understood. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe ticked the box on the questionnaire donating $100 to the African child, put a new banknote into the previously stamped and addressed envelope. She dropped it into her handbag with grim satisfaction. Then the noise started. It was all around her, a dull throb which arose from the bowels of the building, shaking every wall, making the floor below her vibrate and hum, whilst the ceiling gave the complementary stereo effect. It was all embracing irritation. Hardly loud enough that one could reasonably claim that it would wake or disturb most mildly deaf or preoccupied people, it nevertheless bore into her like a bad toothache, filling her consciousness with a jarring edge of unease that made real peace of mind impossible. She had, she knew, become hypersensitive to the noise. When it stopped, she waited for its resumption like an addict waiting for his next supply. Music did nothing to cover it up, and even earplugs never quite cut out the deeper underlying boom which worked somewhere in the pit of her stomach. It was impossible to move. The company, the property management, the police, which she had summoned one Sunday morning, and even David could not quite see the problem. There were suggestions of her neuroticism, that she should get out more, and of Hong Kong conditions. Even her doctor had prescribed the tranquilizer reluctantly. It was rather ironic that the week after the piano, the grandmother clock and the leather sofas had arrived from England, the drills and mixers had moved in. The thought of uprooting herself, even temporarily, yet again was unthinkable. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe put on her Burberry and snaffled Gucci shoes, a recent acquisition thought de rigueur by Jill, shooed the dog towards the still visibly contrite Ruby, and squeezed herself into the hallway with practiced adroitness, closing the mock oak door with brass lion head knocker behind her. When her mistress was gone, Ruby cursed the dog in Tagalog and sat down in her favourite kitchen chair, musing on her present predicament. She was wondering when David was going to tell his wife that it was all over. The behaviour she had witnessed that morning did not point to any dramatic development. On the contrary, Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe looked more confident than she had seemed for some time. Marital relations, she knew, had not resumed their dreary course. David was ensconced in the guest room with his Casio portable television and cheap alarm clock, like a disgraced puppy. His wife clearly still had the power, although it was difficult to see the justification. Europeans were imponderable creatures. They had everything but the most essential, the ability to dance, to live, to change. Their waste and greed, particularly the children's, disgusted her, and now, after she had been assured by David that he was going to leave his wife, it looked as if they were not capable of even the most basic honesty. Mysterious people indeed, living together when the spark has gone. How had David put it? My marriage is 2 squeezed lemons on autopilot. That described their marriage very well, she thought, and she did not blame David for wanting a change. Men were made to change their women, and thank God they did, no matter what the priest said. Everyone knew that love kept the world going. As David said, sex is the food of the 90s. So why didn't he live up to his ideas? Just then, Mark appeared from his bedroom with his Walkman already installed, and with a slight nod to Ruby, sat at the table to devour what remained of the breakfast set some 3 hours earlier. The hiss of Mark's headphones indicated a brain-deadening heavy metal track of more than usual monotony. Toast, he grunted, with the unnecessary volume and emphasis of the profoundly deaf. Ruby took 2 slices of the cotton wool bread beloved by Mark and his sister and deposited them in the slots of the toaster. Mark was now with her in the non-hourly modified world and was grunting something else. Got any more eggs? These are cold. They were indeed cold. Such a pity, thought Ruby, that she could not throw Mark into the bin as quickly and as easily as she discarded the scrambled eggs, which could feed her neighbour's family in Marinduque for 2 days. She wondered when the imposition of the school vacation would come to an end. 2 more weeks at least, and she could resume her enjoyment of some hours of rest and seclusion. What's up, Ruby? Still looking for a job? Ruby sat down at the table again, feigning her usual air of dizzy compliance. Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do, Master Mark. No one wants a maid anymore. My cousin had an address, but they took a Thai girl in the end. Finished contract. Mark did not know the real reason for her sudden decision to leave. He had been told that she was unhappy to be so far away from her aunt and cousins who worked in the New Territories. Mark stood up, eructated slightly, and headed into the lounge for his morning dose of satellite TV. He rarely stayed on one channel for long, preferring to skip from one to the other every 10 seconds or so in a frenetic search for something sensational. But, as all his friends knew, Hong Kong was boring, a place where the best things in life were skateboarding, booze, and the occasional reefer, particularly at school. School was the biggest drawback of all. Meanwhile, in Central, Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe had just arrived at the Active Life Centre. Jill McManus met her in the small bookshop cum coffee lounge, which always smelled of some new concoction of Brenda, the aromatherapist. Today's odour was particularly irritating, something like Scotch pine mixed with turpentine. The sign on the notice board read, "Today's aroma, sandalwood and myrrh from Sabah, calming and invigorating for the treatment of lethargy and stress." "Oh, nice to see. Just having a quick water processed. Tastes just great. Why don't you have one, dear? You look quite shattered." Jill was dressed with so many gold bangles that morning that she had slight difficulty lifting her hand to stir her bituminous double decaf espresso. Her trouser suit was too tight around the bust as usual, and the breast looked in imminent danger of expulsion from her capacious brassiere. She had had some gilding done to her naturally greying blonde hair, which now sparkled unnaturally in the harsh halogen lamps of the cafe bookshop. "Look, dear, I've just been reading this book about life dynamic numerology. It's all in your birth date, apparently. Everyone swears by it." The gaudy cover of the book showed a beaming fat woman dressed in some kind of oriental shroud. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe thought she recognized her from somewhere. "Isn't she the one who's always on about how we should imitate her? Can't see why, though. Seems to be a frightful bore. All that positive thinking. It's enough to make anyone into a blithering idiot. What's wrong with being negative? It's quite a good reaction to things sometimes, after all." Jill smiled the smile she reserved for the ridiculous unintelligibility of original, honest, or deviant thought. "What's up, dear?" asked Jill with her usual jauntiness. "You seem a little out of sorts." Again, there was no connection, no thread to pick up, no field of relevance in which to operate. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe persevered. "It's just that, well, I'm a little unsure about David, that's all." "Unsure?" said Jill with a flutter of her heavily mascaraed eyelids. "Yes, I think he could be having an affair." The silence and embarrassment which followed this pronouncement was almost a physical manifestation. "How do you know?" Jill asked finally, her face suddenly flagging and wilting. "I just know. I don't want to go into the details, not just yet. It's been going on for some time." "Who with? I mean, if you don't mind me asking." "A local girl. Nobody you would possibly know." "How peculiar. I always thought he couldn't stand them. I mean, that's what he always said. But you never know in Hong Kong. The place is a veritable knocking shop, if you see what I mean. When did you find out?" "Oh, I found them at it. You know, what's the expression? On the job. At home." "Well, I never. What a shock. When did all this happen?" 2 weeks ago." "What did you say to him?" "Not a word. Of course, he says it was a spare of the moment thing, wouldn't be repeated and so on. But I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm not sure of anything anymore. They were now joined in the coffee shop by a small, batty-looking European woman in batik, Indian bangles and Thai gold slippers. She headed straight for the self-help books. "Well, dear," Jill went on, "if you'll take my advice, you'll just sit this one out until he sees the error of his ways. It's always the best course of action. He'll pull himself together in the end. Husbands always do, if they have any sense. I mean, what can they possibly see in these local bimbos anyway? About as much in common as chalk and cheese. A quick roll in the hay, and what have you got to talk about? It's the intellectual relationship that keeps a relationship alive. This sex business, men are just cursed to stray." Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe listened to the cliches, convincing, comforting, but cliches nevertheless, with increasing impatience, as if Jill McManus knew anything about the real ways of real men, men who are not scuppered before they started by virtue of being attracted to her. You might as well ask Mother Teresa. "When I married Bill, I'd already had 2 divorces, and I told him straight the first time he strayed I'd make it a 3rd settlement. You grow hardened after the 2nd, I think. He knows I mean business. Now, I don't mind if they have a quick fling with some girlie in Manila or Bangkok, as long as they're careful. But if it becomes a regular commitment, well, then I think about the lawyers. And quite honestly, I'm even drawing the line at quick flings, what with all this AIDS about. I don't want to go before my time, if you see what I mean." This was the perfect cue for something, but Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe remained silent. She looked at the exotically dressed visitor, who was now buying a copy of Zen in Hong Kong. Perhaps the answer was in something the centre had to offer, numerology perhaps accepted. Finally she began, slowly, to spell things out for once. "I don't think you understand. This is a crisis. There's nothing easy and snappy to say or do. It's just hell, and it's beyond me. Understand?" Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe's eyes watered, but real tears wouldn't come. Jill's face once more fell into its creased reality in an approximation of genuine concern. "Dear, you are in a pickle. You need a drink." "I don't need a drink, or a holiday, or a shrink, or some aromatherapy, or some B vitamins, or the Maharishi Yogi. For God's sake, try and come up with something original, for once in your life." Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe stood up violently, displacing the table sufficiently to knock the rest of Jill McManus's ersatz coffee into the lady's expensive silk lap. Jill shooed the liquid away from the fabric in an ecstasy of panic. The liquid trickled onto the shiny wooden floor of the cafe in 4 viscous puddles. As Jill McManus was scanning her memory for good dry cleaners and somewhere she could purchase something to ride home in, Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe was walking mechanically through the busy crowded Central, bumping into more people than she successfully avoided. People were staring. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe did not care. She was enjoying the clumsy physical contact with the people she hated, their looks of alarm and outrage as she pushed their shoulders and briefcases, brushed against their portable telephones, and stood on their diminutive, sensibly shoed feet. It was, she felt, a triumph of self-expression. Passing Landmark, she looked up to Gloucester Towers, towards one of the tiny windows behind which she knew David would be sitting, adjusting figures, listening to boring clients, and every now and again thinking about some cheap woman he had glimpsed in the lift or from his car on the way to work. In fact, David was doing none of these things. He was indeed in his office, and to a cursory viewer of his half-partitioned den in the large crowded premises of a large investment banker, he was scrutinizing figures. But his mind was miles away and in no sense engaged in sexual fantasy. However delightful such a change in his present preoccupations might have been, David's large but actually slim body slouched in his swivel chair, whilst his neat, slightly greying hair lifted gently in the small fan he had bought that morning to assist the circulation of thrice-used air in the office. His face, conventionally handsome in an appealingly boyish way, did not betray more than a hint of the turmoil within him. Turmoil, he thought, was the best word. The expense and inconvenience of divorce was perhaps in the end unavoidable. Two thoughts, however, kept running through his mind as he considered giving Brendan, his lawyer friend, more than a social telephone call. One was the persistent idea that he would almost certainly call it a day in a new relationship given time. The idea of actually conducting day-to-day life with his present circle of girls was so abhorrent to him that he would prefer to remain a bachelor. But then, what would happen to his life without someone to talk to all those unexciting hours the days brought, at breakfast time, on Sunday morning, on Sunday afternoon? The other idea was that he would be a perfect fool to leave Dorothy for, amongst other candidates, a domestic servant. They surely were ten a penny. It wasn't so much shame, he didn't care what people thought, but the fear of being so much like some of the blithering fools who had married girls from the Philippines, common men with pot bellies and tattooed forearms. Or there were the men like Joachim Sturzenegger, who kept his, he had to admit, sensationally beautiful Filipina wife in his flat like a cross between an orchid and a consumer appliance, to be first sniffed at and admired by one's friends, then employed for private entertainment after everyone else had gone home. No, if he left Dorothy, it would not be for Ruby, it would be for Candy. Candy had agreed to have lunch with him, and David was in so much of a flutter in the final hour beforehand that he considered taking a swig from the quarter bottle of Dewar's he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk for emergencies. Candy would have noticed the smell on his breath, just as she noticed everything else. Candy Young, despite her lowly position in a competing firm some 3 floors below, was as sharp as a razor. She also happened to have the sweetest smile and the most agile kissing tongue imaginable. In their protracted push-me, pull-me affair, largely consisting of lunches and early dinners, followed by groping in the back of David's Acura, parked in a secluded corner of the Peak, Candy had kept a firm hold on her virginity, despite David's hot, wandering hands. She clearly knew what dynamite she kept hidden between her soft, David believed, thighs, and small but luscious, David surmised, breasts. In short, she was 23 and an indefatigable flirt and tease. David was completely under her apparently virginal spell. He called her Araldite Knickers, while she referred to him privately as the teddy bear. The affair had taken a huge leap forward once the nicknames had been exchanged and explained, for Candy's English, although quite passable, did not extend to superglue and lingerie. The tension between them was unbearable, and David hoped it wouldn't last forever. For Candy's part, David was another part-time boyfriend, vaguely interesting, and that he was a foreigner and rich, she thought. She knew he was married, although David had never told her. It did not matter. She had no intention of becoming seriously attached to a foreigner. Candy was waiting for him in the secluded English reproduction pub they met in sometimes when David was feeling especially insecure. The waitresses were all English, and the clientele were a mixed crowd of Chinese, large resident foreigners, and inappropriately dressed tourists experiencing the local colour. She was reading one of the local gossip magazines, which were tending to have more and more revealing glossy covers these days, David thought. He would often flick through one at the hairdressers. They contained photographs of Hong Kong's rich and famous at parties and receptions, a catalogue of imitation Western culture with vacuous plutocrats in gaudy settings, which were usually a fitting background to the tasteless personalities represented. "Candy, I'd like to lick you," he whispered. It was an old joke between them. Candy smiled a curious feline smile she reserved for arrivals and departures, or for special moments of intimacy. It was the same smile she evinced when David gave her one of his presents. "Hello, David. You look a little tired," she enunciated carefully in a slightly contralto voice. "You're very busy at the moment." "Not very. It's just that..." At that moment a burly waitress with red hair and a fresh complexion brought them a menu in a thick leather cover emblazoned with the pub's distinctive red lion. "What a good idea to show more of your legs," he said once the waitress had gone. Candy smiled coyly. "It is for you." "And how is Rambo in the office?" Rambo was Candy's boss, an American family man with a bodybuilder figure, and David's projection of all possible rivals to Candy's affections in the expatriate community. "He is, like always, boring." There was a pause. At last, as usual, David took the initiative. "I'm having quite a lot of problems." "Problems?" "Yes. Girlfriends. Not really girlfriends, more girls, if you see what I mean." Candy exhibited the stony silence she maintained when important information was at hand. "It's just that, well, I have to say that I'm just tired of messing around with so many. Maybe you have the same problem. I can't believe you don't. With men, I mean. What I mean to say is that, well, I think I wouldn't mind getting a little more serious with you, which would only be fair in the end, and a lot less strain for me." Candy sucked on her cola thoughtfully, bending the adjustable end of her straw slightly upwards as she did so. "I will have to think about this. It's quite sudden." At least there was hope, as always, but David pressed his point. "You don't understand. I'm in a crisis. I have to know from you soon whether there's any future for us. Seriously, I'm tired of playing around." Candy looked at David intently, bent her head slightly to one side, and smiled. "I think you are very emotional." "Look, Candy," David went on, I want you to give me an answer. Is there any point in going on this way together? Don't you find it all a bit of a waste of time?" "Time?" The food arrived. David and Candy took their napkins and began to attack the slippery mounds of steak and kidney pudding before them. "It's very unusual. The first time I have this," said Candy, exploring the food gingerly with the prong points of her fork. "It's a real English specialty. Very tasty, actually. You want some rice?" "Perhaps later." At that moment, in mid-levels, the workmen were playing cards on a small platform secured carelessly to the balcony of the Tregunter-Smythe's flat. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe was watching them through the lycra lace curtains with murder on her mind. To be denied the most fundamental liberty, in her view, the liberty not to be among the Chinese, had been somehow denied her. They were brought literally to her window. Why they chose her floor to ape around on was a mystery. Surely her looks of venomous disapproval when she had rescued the plants would have been clear to even the terminally obtuse. It was obviously deliberate, a slow wearing down of the inner self, an oriental torture of devilish cunning. Mid-levels suddenly seemed a dark continent. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe needed to fight back. After some time deliberating stratagems, she decided what to do. Only direct action of a subtle kind would work. Fight the hordes with their own weapons. She would show them, once and for all. Mark shuffled into the living room from his afternoon siesta, a period of semi-cataleptic somnolence aided by marijuana, commonly ranging between 2 and 5 hours. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe suspected he had taken up masturbation. Men needed a hobby, after all. "So glad you could make it, Mark," Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe began. "I was beginning to think you had died. We should be so lucky, of course, but there would be an awful lot of space all of a sudden. It would be such a shock. We could always take a lodger, I imagine, until we got used to your absence." Mark took out his earphones. "At me again. It's not my fault. You're going through a midlife crisis." Ruby returned with Bonnie still straining at the leash. "Did you take her for a good run this time?" "Yes, ma'am. All the way to Central Market." This was a lie. Ruby's technique of exercising Bonnie was to let it off the lead a little in some secluded spot of grass near the playground close to the tower block. She had formerly let the dog run along the road with her on her own walks. Unfortunately, Bonnie had quickly learned to dodge the traffic. Ruby was thinking about dinner. David would probably not be in that evening, so she took 2 TV dinners out of the freezer. She herself could not eat such food, snipped open the bag of supermarket shredded lettuce, and made sure there was enough beer, wine, and fizzy cola cooling for her guzzling masters. She then found her way to her quarters, a cramped 100 square feet of freedom from the Tregunter-Smythes. Dodging the line of newly washed intimate apparel and nearly tripping over the camp bed as usual, she sat on a plastic chair and began to cry. On the spacious balcony, meanwhile, Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe was putting her plan into action. Steeled by several generous shots from a bottle of rare single malt whiskey, which David believed he had managed to hide under his store of Japanese teenage pornography in the guest bedroom, she hacked away at one of the bindings securing the workers' platform to the balcony. It was easier than she thought. Only 5 or 6 clean swings with the kitchen chopper were necessary to do the trick. Exhausted, she sat on one of the velvet armchairs, feeling better than she had done for years. The chopper lay before her on the precious marble table, etched with the marks of her direct action. At that moment there was the sound of a fumbled but legal entry at the front door. It was David, inebriated practically to immobility. His tie was askew, but still knotted tightly about 2 inches to the left of centre. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Come and join the party." "Don't mind if I do. Got any food?" "I'll fix you something. Just a minute." Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe was happy. Reconciliation was in the air. David had been drinking all afternoon after another attempt to bring some kind of centre to his love life. Candy had merely smiled as usual, leaving all options open. What was it with Chinese girls? What exactly did they want? In a brief moment of relief and resignation, the first he had experienced all day, he took a swig from the curiously familiar bottle of spirits on the coffee table and stepped onto the balcony, breathing as much oxygen as mid-levels could supply during the rush hour on a sticky summer day. He did not see the pile Bonnie had deposited on returning from her walk. David literally slid some 2 feet, caught the edge of the balcony, slipped again, but felt himself momentarily secure as he gripped the platform support. He sat on the balcony railing, holding on to the platform's supporting poles like some trapeze artist. He was serene once more. Hong Kong could neither defeat him nor his marriage. Women in Asia, what were they? A great waste of time. When the support gave way, Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe had just poured the ice cubes into the Perspex cooler and taken some cocktail snacks from the well-stocked cupboard above the Eschermann-fitted cooker. When she heard the snap, she thought it was yet another of Bonnie's pranks. She did not miss David or notice the absence of the platform for a full 15 minutes. The police, finding the chopper on the coffee table, were convinced for some time they were dealing with a domestic. Ruby told them all about the marital difficulties, and Mark filled out the background with his marijuana-induced babblings. The newspaper men had a field day, referring to a love triangle, certain substances, schoolboy porn and drugs ring, and crime of passion. David recovered fully, having had his fall broken by 3 similar platforms on his way down. He was not sure whether he had been pushed. Bonnie was sent to the RSPCA. The police eventually dropped all charges against Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe on the grounds of insufficient evidence. Ruby took a job as a black market salesgirl and later opened her own clothes stall in Mongkok. Mark was sent to a boarding school in England and is now studying architecture with general studies at Lancaster University. Mrs. Tregunter-Smythe gained a legal separation on the grounds of adultery and has never been so prosperous and happy. Jill McManus never quite got the water-processed decaf stains out of her frock, but sent her friend the bill.